Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today we're doing a deep dive into youth justice in Canada and trying to figure out, well, how fair and equitable it really is.
Yeah, and that's a big one, right? Because what does fair even mean when we're talking about a system that's supposed to hold people accountable for their actions, but also offer a path to rehabilitation, especially with young people?
Exactly. You can't treat a 15-year-old who got caught shoplifting the same way you'd treat, I don't know, a career criminal, right?
Context is key.
So how does Canada try to balance those things? How do they try to protect society, but also give young offenders a chance to turn things around?
Well, that's what we're here to unpack, right?
Let's jump into it.
Sounds good.
Now, one of our sources used this really interesting example, like a thought experiment.
Okay.
Imagine this. You're walking down the street, and you see a group of teenagers hanging around outside a store.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And the thing is, the store window is smashed, like someone obviously vandalized it. So naturally, you're thinking, okay, someone needs to be held responsible for this, right?
Right, there should be consequences for that kind of behavior.
But then you think about it. These are teenagers we're talking about.
Yeah.
Is punishment always the most effective way to deal with these situations?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, will it actually teach them a lesson or just make them more likely to end up in trouble again later on?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's exactly where things start to get really interesting with youth justice.
So how does Canada approach these kinds of situations?
Well, that's where the Youth Criminal Justice Act comes in, the YCJA.
Right, I've heard of that, but to be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on the details.
Yeah, no worries. It can be confusing.
So what's the YCJA all about then?
Well, it basically throws out the idea of a one-size-fits-all approach to justice when it comes to young people.
Okay, that makes sense. Kids are different.
Exactly. Instead of just focusing on punishment, the YCJA wants us to consider what's actually going to help this young person make better choices moving forward.
It's more about rehabilitation than just throwing the book at them.
Precisely. The YCJA operates on the understanding that young people are still developing. Their brains aren't even fully formed yet.
Oh, definitely. Teenagers, I've got a couple myself. Trust me, I know their brains are still under construction.
Laugh softly. Exactly. And because of that, the YCJA prioritizes giving them a chance to learn from their mistakes and become productive members of society.
So it's about giving them a chance to prove they can do better, to make things right.
Right. And in many cases, it even tries to keep them from being burdened with a criminal record, understanding the impact that can have on their future opportunities, getting a job, going to school, all of that.
Oh, yeah, that's huge. I mean, everyone makes mistakes, especially when you're young and figuring things out. It seems like the YCJA is saying a dumb decision as a teenager shouldn't derail your entire life.
Yeah, that's the idea. It recognizes that context matters, but this whole rehabilitation-focused approach, well, it can be controversial.
Controversial, how so?
Well, some people argue that by focusing so heavily on giving young people a second chance, the YCJA might not always adequately address the need for accountability or deter future crime.
So it's like a constant balancing act between giving second chances and making sure justice is served.
Exactly, and finding that balance, well, it can get messy.
Messy how?
Well, our sources actually highlighted a really powerful example, the 2006 Edmonton hockey riot.
Oh, wow. I remember. Wasn't that after the Oilers lost the Stanley Cup Finals?
That's the one.
Yeah, things got pretty crazy, if I remember correctly.
They did, and you had people of all ages caught up in this chaotic event, some engaging in vandalism, others getting swept up in the moment. It was intense.
Yeah, crowds can be like that, unpredictable. It's like mob mentality takes over sometimes.
Absolutely. And in situations like that, the question becomes, how do you apply the principles of the YCJA fairly? Do you focus on community restoration, recognizing the influence of the group dynamic, or do you hold individuals accountable, regardless of age, to send a message that there are consequences for this type of behavior?
Man, that's a tough one. I can see how things could get tricky really fast in a situation like that.
Yeah, it really throws a wrench in things, doesn't it? I mean, when you've got something like a riot with this mix of people and motivations.
Right, like where do you even begin to sort through all of that?
Exactly. In the Edmonton riot, it really brought those tensions to the forefront,
In what way?
Well, on one hand, you had people saying, hey, we need to cut these kids some slack.
Okay, I can see that side, like they got caught up in the moment, they're not bad kids, just made some bad choices kind of thing.
Exactly, emphasizing the influence of the group, the chaos of the situation, and that whole idea that young people, they have a huge capacity for growth and change, right?
Second chances and all that.
Right, but then on the other side, you had people saying, no way, actions have consequences, and that goes double when it's something as serious as a riot.
Yeah, I mean, property damage potential for violence, it's not something to be taken lightly.
Absolutely. And those advocating for a tougher approach, they argued that regardless of age, when you cross that line, you need to be held accountable, send a message that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated.
So it was basically a clash between those two perspectives, leniency versus taking a hard line.
Exactly. And the courts, they were stuck in the middle trying to figure out how to apply the law in a way that felt fair and just given the circumstances.
So how do things actually play out? Like, do the courts end up leaning more towards rehabilitation or punishment in that case?
Well, it's interesting because the outcomes were all over the map. Some young offenders involved received pretty lenient sentences.
Like what, community service, that sort of thing?
Yeah, often it involved things like community service, probation. Sometimes they'd be required to participate in restorative justice programs.
So trying to repair the harm that was caused, make amends with the community.
Exactly. And in those cases, it seems like the courts were really trying to emphasize rehabilitation, recognizing the context of the riot and believing that these individuals had the potential to turn their lives around.
Which aligns with the whole point of the YCJA.
Right, exactly. But then on the flip side, you had other individuals, some of whom were also young offenders who faced much harsher consequences.
What made the difference there?
Well, it seems like the severity of their actions played a role. For example, those who were identified as instigators, the ones who were egging others on, or those who caused significant damage or harm to people or property, they were more likely to face stricter penalties.
So it wasn't just about age, it was about the role they played in the riot and the severity of their actions.
Precisely. It highlights how complex this whole issue of fairness and equity is, especially within the context of youth justice.
Right, because there's no easy answer. It's not as simple as saying everyone gets off easy because they're young, or everyone gets punished equally regardless of the circumstances.
Exactly. It's about trying to find that sweet spot, that balance between recognizing that young people are still developing and deserve a chance to make things right, but also understanding that actions have consequences and accountability matters.
It's like walking a tightrope, trying to stay balanced and not tip too far one direction or the other.
A very delicate balancing act.
It's interesting, though, thinking about the riot and how differently things played out for those involved. It kind of reminds me of that whole image of Lady Justice with a blindfold,
Oh yeah, blind justice, everyone is equal in the eyes of the law.
Right, but we know it's not always that simple in reality. Like, there's always context. There's a human story behind every case, behind every decision.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this whole conversation so fascinating, because it pushes us to move beyond these abstract ideas of justice and really grapple with the messy realities of the system and how those ideals translate, or sometimes don't translate, into real-world outcomes.
So how do we square that circle? Like, how do we reconcile the ideal of blind justice with the fact that context always matters?
Well, one of the things that really stuck with me from our sources was a quote from former Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin.
I've heard of her. Wasn't she the first woman to hold that position?
That's right. She had a long and impactful career on the Supreme Court. And in one of her speeches, she talked about this very idea, how we define a just society.
And what did you have to say about that?
Well, she argued that it's not just about blindly following the letter of the law. It's about creating a society where everyone feels safe, respected, and like they have a chance to thrive. And for her, that was the true measure of justice.
So it's about more than just punishment or even just rehabilitation. It's about building a society that values fairness, understanding, and compassion.
Exactly. And that's where the real challenge lies, because how do we actually define fairness? I mean, is it about treating everyone equally, regardless of age or their individual circumstances? Or is it about taking those factors into account to ensure that everyone has a genuine opportunity to succeed?
That's a tough question, and it feels especially relevant when we're talking about young people who are still figuring things out, making mistakes, and trying to find their place in the world.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that they're not finished products yet. They're still works in progress. And the way we choose to interact with them, especially within the justice system, it can have a profound impact on the trajectory of their lives.
It's true, isn't it? It's like we're always trying to find that balance, that right approach. And the YCJA, it reflects that struggle. So you're saying it's not about saying, okay, every young offender gets a get-out-of-jail-free card, but it's also not about throwing away the key just because they made a mistake.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that there are times when protecting society, keeping people safe, that might mean imposing tougher consequences, especially if we're talking about serious offenses.
Right. Like, we can't just ignore the harm that's been done.
But then on the other hand, There are situations where giving a young person a genuine shot at rehabilitation, at turning their life around, that might actually be the best way to prevent future crime, to make everyone safer in the long run.
So it's about looking at each case individually, considering all the angles.
Exactly. It requires us to think critically, not just about the law, but about human behavior, about what we value as a society, about what we believe leads to true justice and lasting change.
And that's what makes this whole discussion so fascinating, right? I mean, it's not just about some abstract legal concepts. It's about real people, real lives, and the choices we make as a society about how to deal with crime, with harm, and with the potential for redemption, especially for young people.
Absolutely. And the YCJA, with its focus on rehabilitation, with its efforts to help young offenders find a path away from the justice system, it reflects a certain set of values, don't you think?
In what way?
Well, it suggests that as a society, at least in principle, we believe in second chances. We believe in the possibility of growth and change, even in the face of mistakes, even when harm has been done.
It's a hopeful perspective. It's saying that these young people, they're not defined by their worst moments, that they have the potential to learn, to grow, to become productive members of society.
Precisely. And that's a powerful message, but it also comes with a challenge, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, it challenges us to examine our own beliefs, our own biases, to really ask ourselves what we believe fairness and equity look like in practice, especially when it comes to young people who are still finding their way, who are still figuring out who they are and who they want to be.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into youth justice in Canada, I think it's safe to say there are no easy answers.
Definitely not. It's a complex issue with a lot of gray areas, but that's what makes it so important to talk about, to grapple with these questions, to keep searching for that balance between accountability and compassion, between punishment and rehabilitation.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll leave you with this. If you were tasked with designing a justice system for young people, what would you prioritize? What values would guide your decisions? Would you lean more towards a rehabilitative approach, like the YCJA? Or would you advocate for stricter consequences, a greater emphasis on punishment? It's a question worth pondering, a question that each of us have to answer for ourselves as we navigate the complexities of justice in our own lives and in the world around us. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.